Welcome to Holistic History. I'm Russell Myrie. Once a month, I'll delve into a topic or event, try to break it down, and see what I can find. Please subscribe at shows.acast.com/holistic-history for the third and final episode of any season. Why is there a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Manchester and London? Well, firstly, I'm happy to recognise Manchester as a historically progressive city with lots of examples you can point to. Another notable monument in the great city commemorates the Peterloo Massacre. In the summer of 1819, 18 people were killed and hundreds, 500 plus, although exact numbers are hard to pin down, were injured when the cavalry, essentially the establishment on horseback in the years just before the formation of the police forces we know it today, charged into a crowd of peaceful protesters who wanted pay and conditions that reflected what their labour was worth. Later on, I'll be briefly touching on aspects of the Chartist movement that, around 20 years after Peterloo, began advocating for many of the rights that exist today. Fast forward a bit, and in the immediate months after the end of World War II, the Fifth Pan-African Congress was held in Manchester. W.E.B. Du Bois was joined by the likes of Kwame Nkrumah for a meeting which was crucial in the post-war push for independence from colonialism. The reason the statue exists is because of the Lancashire Cotton Famine, which is an interesting event or moment in time because it links a lot of things together. Attitudes to the poor and the class relationships that existed at the time, the concerns around class in the UK at the time between working people and the working class people who own small local businesses that have always been the heartbeat of any community, and the industrialists who own the means of mass production, but also the wealthy industrialists who had come from a more working class background, who had become rich, and therefore looked at things a little bit differently, when all of this was occurring during the later stages of the Industrial Revolution. It highlights the extent to which the free labour of enslaved black Americans was fueling the economy in England in a way which is rarely acknowledged properly. It's well known that around the same time, many petty criminals found themselves deported to Australia and New Zealand for relatively minor crimes. Well, the Lancashire Cotton Famine caused many folks to make the choice to emigrate to Australasia. Shipping companies slashed prices and the governments made it as easy as possible to move there. The Cotton Famine obviously happened between 1861 and 1865 when the Civil War was being fought in the United States. It's one of those occasions when the collective power of ordinary, everyday people, if ordinary is the right term to use when encountering empathy to this wonderful degree, the solidarity and sympathy with the plight and cause of enslaved black people in the United States, and the willingness to suffer because of it. An amazing example of the human spirit. Of course, many people supported the Confederacy. It wasn't all good, but there's still a lot of nice things in this series to warm the heart. So, where's a good place to start? The invention of the spinning jenny seems to be a good place. It was invented by Lancastrian cotton weaver James Hargreaves in 1764, and it has one of those sweet backstories that you really wish is true, but isn't. If it was true, it would have been a really nice touch that it was named after his daughter, who inspired the invention when she accidentally knocked over a spinning wheel that carried on turning, supposedly causing the eureka moment that led to the innovation. I would love that story to be true. It does give you an idea of why the invention was so innovative and important, but it's a lot more likely that the name came from a shortening of the word engine to ginny. The kind of thing you can imagine people who worked with them all the time saying to each other throughout the day. It was the first multi-spindle machine. It could spin 8 threads at once, rather than just the one, and as time went on, the number increased. How did this change things? It allowed cotton to be mass-produced. It meant that the factories that subsequently became ubiquitous began producing cotton in far higher volumes than the small local businesses ever could. It might not be a perfect comparison, but it may be a bit like AI now. Maybe streaming services and traditional TV is a better analogy, but the general idea is obvious. The spinning jenny was an innovation that rendered the specialized bespoke approach that previously characterized, in this case, the clothing and textile industry, obsolete. The machines were faster, which meant more money, and we all know that talks the loudest. There had been other innovations throughout the earlier part of the 18th century, such as John Kay's flying shuttle, but the spinning jenny was the really consequential game changer. It was kind of like when Rakim began rapping in the mid 80s. It was just on another level to anything that had happened before. It had a huge effect on the textile industry, the Industrial Revolution, and therefore the towns and cities of Lancashire and northern England, which grew exponentially as people moved from the countryside to the growing industrialised urban areas. The increased supply lowered the prices, which led to increased demand for cotton products as they became more affordable, changing fashions and shopping habits and the like. As you can imagine, the households who relied on the older methods for their income were not happy that their product was suddenly worth a lot less money and that they'd been, in effect, replaced. Think of those angry mobs in The Simpsons, the kind that spring up from time to time whenever Homer or whoever does something silly, and you may be close to having a picture of how the folks from Blackburn, where Hargreaves was born and raised, reacted. They were so put out that they broke into his home and took out their anger on his spinning jenny machines and made it so dangerous for him locally that he decided to move to Nottingham and set up his businesses there. Hargreaves was relatively prosperous, not as much as he perhaps deserved to be, until his death in 1778. Until the 1860s, things progressed as you might expect. The industry grew and things were ticking over nicely. Now, some cotton came from Egypt, some came from India via the East India Company, but the southern states of the United States produced much more of the high quality cotton that was crucial to this aspect of the Industrial Revolution. The humidity and long summers that made toiling in the fields from sunup to sundown so soul destroyingly unbearable for enslaved African Americans also provided the perfect conditions to grow lots of cotton and make lots of money for everybody but them. The notion of cotton being king is probably the closest those in the slave supporting southern states would come to tacitly acknowledging how important the forced free labour of enslaved Africans was to their world. A political cartoon from the time featuring John Bull, a character who represented England and Britain, illustrated the popular sentiment in the South at the time. This character had been around in his popular form since the mid 18th century, so audiences in Britain and the United States would have been very familiar with him and what he represented by the mid 19th century, when the Civil War erupted, which was an Englishman from the countryside and the aims and interests of England. John Bull always wears a top hat and tails, a waistcoat, and carries a walking stick, and always looks as if something or someone is getting on his nerves, and he'd rather be down the pub moaning about the quality of the beer than dealing with whatever issue is at hand, whatever you're bothering him with. John Bull is kneeling in front of a bale of cotton that has a crown on its head, a sceptre in its hand, and an aloof expression on its face to show that this represents the high status of cotton, akin to royalty and its king, in a similar way to a person getting a knighthood or, kind of thing, an official honour from royalty. Amongst other things, the King Cotton character tells John Bull that, I must insist on the African slave trade. John Bull, who has a piece of paper with the word Manchester hanging out of his back pocket, is careful to tell the cotton monarch, that's no affair of ours, manage it as you like. Only sell us plenty of the staple. And that is exactly how he talked. This is what people like John Henry Hammond, a senator and former governor of South Carolina, who coined the term cotton is king in 1858, hoped was true in the years that preceded the Civil War. He was right in thinking it was important. It had, after all, transformed a huge part of northern England economically. So, a few years later, in 1861, when the Civil War broke out after decades of slavery based tension, the South knew how important cotton was to the British economy. So much so that they thought there was a chance withholding the supply of cotton may cause Britain, and hopefully France too, to join the Civil War on their side. or at the very least recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, or at the very least, be more sympathetic diplomatically to their general cause, the preservation of slavery. It seems that Britain has regularly faced the question of whether or not to join a North American conflict. Is that a question that will ever go away? You have to wonder, and then you have to hope. King Cotton diplomacy, as it was called, was one of the main reasons the South felt confident about seceding from the Union to begin with. The Civil War was inevitable for lots of reasons. The growing number of slave rebellions and runaways, the abolitionist movement, and perhaps most notoriously, the slave catchers disrupting life and businesses in northern states. But without the cotton and the force-free black labor that produced it, they wouldn't have gone into the war with any real sense of confidence that they would win, that it would be worth it. That in the hypothetical situation where the Confederacy won the Civil War, they'd have something to trade with the world afterwards. While the pro-slavery South was right to recognize that cotton was important to the British economy, they completely failed to anticipate the backlash their decision to withhold cotton caused. Britain had abolished slavery across the Caribbean in 1833 and domestically in 1807, and if they had any sense of the realpolitik, they would have known the strength of abolitionist feeling in Britain at the time, even if many of the establishment, who had insisted on compensation when the enslaved Africans were freed, were wholly unconcerned with the ethics of it all, and tended to even identify with the South as a landowning class. The South wrongly believed that support was replicated across the country. But then again, the pro-slavery South tried to argue that slavery was not only fine, not inhumane and unspeakably, disgustingly, you might say, savagely cruel, but actually benevolent and just part of the natural order of things. There were pro-slavery Brits at the time who weren't part of the establishment in any way, and some proudly flew Confederate flags. We'll get into that a bit later. But the support was nowhere near as widespread as the South imagined it to be, or hoped it was. By the time the pro-slavery South realized that Cotton wasn't even a baron or viscount, let alone a king, it was too late. The Union Army, on Abraham Lincoln's orders, had blockaded the southern ports, and the cotton wasn't going anywhere. If they hadn't overplayed their hand in such an overt way, it may have worked out differently, and the money from cotton may have helped the Southern war effort. Factors including their hubris meant that European involvement was never a question the Union had to contend with. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston declared Britain neutral in May 1861, a month after the war had started. Lord Palmerston, who famously said that Britain didn't have permanent allies, only permanent interests, hedged his bets and may have continued to trade cotton in the same amount with the Confederacy after the blockade if he had found a way to facilitate this. He certainly traded as much as he could with both sides of the conflict, things like grain and weapons. He would have been wary about what all of this would have meant for British interests in Canada. He also would have known that he had to be careful not to alienate the North. He would have considered everything and how that might have worked out for him politically and for Britain as a nation. But it's worth considering how things may have been different if he'd chosen to officially recognise the Confederacy. At the very least, I think it would have prolonged the Civil War. Palmerston declared both the North and South as belligerents. He recognised there was a civil war occurring. A very serious thing was happening between two opposing forces, if not two fully fledged nations in this case. But it allowed him to still trade with both entities and protect British shipping as much as possible. While knowing he had to keep the North on side in the event that they won, one of his many considerations, paradoxically, was that a weakened United States in the event of a Northern defeat, a country that had grown in power and stature throughout the 19th century, was good for Britain's position on the world stage. He was obviously right because once the Civil War and Reconstruction and all of that was not behind the United States, not an all immediate, all consuming question anymore in the way that it was before. They grew even further in stature with their imperial war starting in 1898, and then the two world wars in the 20th century, which cemented American dominance until now, really. While Palmerston never recognised the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, the South very nearly got something close to what they wanted with the Trent Affair. Now, I'm not talking about a footballer moving from Liverpool to Real Madrid, but a highly contentious international incident that saw Britain come perilously close to not joining the war on the side of the South, but starting their own war against the United States of America, which would have clearly benefited the Confederate States of America. On November 8th, 1861, when things aren't going so well for the Union, they're still kind of regrouping after the Battle of Bull Run in the summer, which was a victory for the Confederacy and greatly boosted morale in the South. Captain Charles Wilkes of the USS San Jacinto captured Confederate envoys James Murray Mason and John Slidell, who were aboard the British mail ship, the Trent. This occurred off the coast of Cuba. They had been sent by Jefferson Davis to try and obtain British and French recognition of the Confederate States. Davis, the president of the Confederacy, wanted the credibility and respectability this would bring. Two huge powers recognizing the pro slavery cause, and of course he wanted to sell cotton to them and buy weapons and equipment. Now, while Wilkes acted recklessly and didn't receive authorization from anyone in Washington, least of all Lincoln, he wasn't reckless enough to commandeer a British ship, and once he had Mason and Slidell in custody, and they didn't go quietly, he allowed the Trent to sail on from Cuba to England. This raises a lot of questions. If they'd reached England and then France, would they have been successful? Would they have made the personal connections which can determine whether or not diplomacy is successful or otherwise? To what extent would they have been willing to just promise anything the British and French might have wanted? How might this have changed the fortunes of the Confederacy and therefore the Civil War? Mason was a former chairman of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Slidell, a successful lawyer from New Orleans. So Davis had chosen well, he'd chosen effective communicators. It's tempting to think of the backdoor diplomacy that saved planet Earth from World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The less pressurized meetings between Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin paved the way for Kennedy and Khrushchev to negotiate more meaningfully and eventually defuse the crisis. If they hadn't had the relationship to do that, it's terrifying to think of what might have happened. It doesn't necessarily mean that war would have become inevitable, but it was the main reason it ultimately didn't happen. Similarly to the Russian nuclear missiles in Cuba, Britain couldn't just ignore this. It was a British ship, and they were supposed to be neutral in this war. And more than that, in terms of domestic politics, Britannia was supposed to rule the waves. So it was a case of, you can't just come on our ships and do whatever you feel like doing. We are most definitely not having that. Captain Wilkes may have been at least a little restrained with his recklessness, but if Britain let this slide, would the next person or nation or entity do the same? They had to put a stop to this and be seen to be putting a stop to this kind of thing. Palmerston, renowned for his hawkish tendencies, was furious. Now, if this had happened today, when you can instantly communicate in any number of different ways, things may have been different. But diplomacy still had to wait for ships to deliver the news, and therefore nobody knew what had happened until the Trent arrived in England at the end of November 1861. When news broke, Palmerston wasn't the only one who was furious. Popular sentiment at the time strongly favoured war with the United States. The prospect of going to war with the United States became so serious that even Prince Albert decided to get involved. He didn't have any formal authority, but his position obviously carried weight and a lot of influence. His intervention was a crucial one, made even more remarkable when you consider he was very ill and, as it very sadly turned out, on the verge of death. He was roused from his literal deathbed to go through a letter that was expressing Britain's position and take out anything that was likely to inflame the Americans. Palmerston and Foreign Secretary Lord Russell let the language in the first draft of a letter to their American counterparts reflect their profound anger. Some of it performative, this is politics we're talking about, but some of it very, very real. Luckily, Prince Albert was able to intervene with a cooler head and he softened that language significantly. It was less, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough because we think you're out of order. And more, well, I guess at the end of the day, both of us are pretty hard and we could do the whole war thing if we really wanted to. But what do we really gain from fighting? It doesn't really benefit either of us now, does it? It wasn't a given that this would work. The Times, by far the most respected newspaper of the time, captured the mood in an editorial of Thursday, 12th December, 1861. Quote, "It is useless perhaps to make vain guesses at what a few days will disclose, and, while we are urging on our preparations for war, it is to no great purpose that we calculate the possibilities of peace. From hour to hour, it may be even before these words are published, the President's message may reach us in abbreviated form, and thus may give some further means of calculating the chances whether our kinsmen across the ocean will choose justice and peace, or outrage and war. We may, perhaps, find in that message safe generalities from which a prudent government may retire, or prudent counsels which may even have anticipated the coming demand, or, on the other hand, we may read in it some indiscreet declarations in unison with the loose talk of the multitude, and we may find the chief magistrate of the Northern Republic committed to sustain an outrage which leaves us no alternative but war." End quote. This was just over a fortnight after news of the capture of Mason and Slidell had reached Britain, so this was a considered opinion, and not a knee-jerk reaction of the kind which may unfortunately, be expected initially. The situation had become serious enough for troops to be sent to Canada and for ships to be sent to the Western Atlantic. The symbolism of British troops in Canada, with its close proximity to Boston, the city which of course kicked off the War of Independence, would have been very well understood at the time. That both the governor of Massachusetts and the mayor of Boston were among those who publicly praised Wilkes was also very poorly received on this side of the Atlantic. So, despite the fact that Christmas was only a couple of weeks away, there was a distinct lack of goodwill and especially peace. In an article headlined War Rumours and Probabilities from December 16th, 1861, the Times outlined the general feeling in many of the shipping ports outside London. Quote, "In Liverpool, and no doubt in most seaports of the kingdom, much anxiety prevails with respect to what may be the result of the British demand for reparation of the insult committed on our flag by the forcible abduction of the Confederate commissioners from the mail steamer Trent. In the meantime, every reasonable preparation for the worst that can happen is being made with the thoughtfulness and intrepidity which becomes a great people. You can't be a great people and have other nations taking liberties with your ships. The preparations are captured in some detail later on in the article. Quote, "For some time past, Liverpool has been in a state of lively excitement in observing the preparations made to meet the worst emergency which can arise out of the present complication. The splendid steamer Australasian was dispatched from Liverpool on Friday evening for Canada, carrying out 831 men of the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, under charge of Colonel Lord A. Russell and 27 officers. She also took out 254 men and non-commissioned officers of the 4th Brigade of Artillery, under the charge of Captain Leslie. On Saturday, the Royal Mail steamer Niagara sailed for Halifax, having on board Major General Rumley, together with 350 men and 20 officers belonging to the military train. The Persia also, as has been previously stated, has been taken up and fitted as a transport, and this splendid vessel has now, for the first time, had 4 of her boats fitted with Clifford's patent lowering apparatus. Her first complement of troops is to consist of 1,100 men, of whom the 16th Regiment of Foot is to form the principal body. She will also take out 120 men of the Royal Engineers, under command of Captain M.K. Besides the troops mentioned, each of the vessels named also takes out a large amount of military and commissariat stores, amounting, it is said, to 380 tons each." End quote. It's never a good omen when troops start amassing anywhere. I'm sure there are many of us who've watched troops be sent somewhere volatile in the world in recent years and vainly hoped that something could be worked out to prevent any fighting. So there was obvious pressure. And as ever, it's the economy, stupid. The drop in bond prices that followed the trouble caused panic in the markets, and this was obviously just as crucial a factor when Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward are discussing their options as it threatened the North's ability to fund the war. You can't have people cashing out their bonds, that doesn't inspire confidence. So something had to be done to find a way out. The more conciliatory language facilitated by Prince Albert made it easier for Lord Richard Lyons, the British envoy to Washington, to ask Lincoln for a formal apology. It made it easier for Lincoln to agree without being seen to back down, and it definitely made it easier for him to throw Captain Wilkes under the bus. Lincoln didn't make the mistake Hitler made in World War II. Thank God Hitler made that mistake, of starting a war on two fronts, as Hitler did with Russia. He rightly concluded that a side dish of international conflict to accompany the main course of civil war domestically was the last thing he needed, and he ordered that Mason and Slidell were released. Similarly to Jefferson Davis, he wanted to remain in the good graces of international leaders and maintain good and effective diplomatic relations. It is, of course, once again, very sad that Prince Albert died on December 14th, 1861, before the situation was fully resolved. What a hugely important part he played. In early January 1862, Mason and Slidell boarded a ship bound for England for the second time with the same mission, but a significantly decreased chance of achieving it. After the Trent affair, recognizing the Confederacy would have been even more contentious than it would have been before November 1861. Despite all of this stress and general hullabaloo, in the earlier stages of the Civil War, the cotton shortage was yet to be felt. Like most wars, it was initially thought, mostly hoped, that it would be over quickly. In summer 1914, there was widespread belief that the Great War would be over by Christmas. It was hoped that the stocks of cotton stored would be enough to keep the wheels of industry turning and the money flowing in without too much disruption. Well, by December 1861, when the price of middling Orleans cotton had risen by about a third, the industry knew this wasn't going to be the case. The following year saw extreme hardship in the area. When the cotton stopped arriving here, everything stopped. All that machinery just sat there, not doing anything, gathering dust. Lots of idle machinery that didn't have any cotton to spin. The rodents in the factories must have been happy. If there'd been no slavery and therefore no civil war in that parallel universe, everything is all good during the 1860s in northern England, and the Industrial Revolution continues to flourish uninterrupted. Nobody goes hungry, and there's no sudden mass unemployment. In the next episode, I'll look at how this played out and the efforts to help the working people. I'll also look at the amazing empathy demonstrated while enduring the harshest circumstances.